Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you are joining us from today. My name is Chuck Tatham. I am Chief Marketing Officer at Kubex. With me today is Paulo Solari, Product Management Lead for Cloud at Tangoe. And together we are going to cover today's topic. We're going to include some demo. We're going to talk all about this increasingly interesting topic of closing the gap between visibility and observability and governance and actual infrastructure optimization for measurable cost savings. It's a topic that's been hot for some time. It's changing a lot as we get more toward the impact of AI, consumption of AI, the rise of Kubernetes as the way people deploy increasingly modern infrastructure. So there's additional challenges that come with that stuff, but also terrific opportunities to do better in driving efficiency. That's the overall intro. David Chase is here also from Kubex. He will cover the Kubex demo while Paulo will show the product from a Tangoe perspective. So without further ado, the agenda is pretty simple. We've covered the introductions already. We're going to talk a little bit about how we see FinOps evolving, some new challenges, and as I said, some that have lingered for a while. Closing that gap between the FinOps disciplines that are typically thought of and actual infrastructure optimization. We'll explain how these two companies and products address these challenges in a very complementary way. We'll do a demo. I'll introduce you to how Kubex works from an infrastructure optimization perspective. We'll do a small demo of that. And then we have some closing thoughts on ways that you can think about introducing some of these concepts organizationally. And we'll give you some next step options as well, how to get more info. So that's the agenda. I'm going to hand over to Paulo, and he's going to talk a little bit about what Tangoe sees in the world of FinOps. So Paulo, over to you.
Thank you, Chuck, and hello, everybody. Thank you for joining us. I'm not going to spend too much time here, but I do want to set the stage, right? The state of FinOps. You hear this word a lot, especially over the last 5 years. Tangoe's embraced it a lot and kind of dove headfirst into solving FinOps for customers or helping customers solve the topic of FinOps themselves. Now, for better or worse, I would say we've noticed that it's expanding rapidly by having more and more items under its umbrella. It started at just looking at infrastructure costs, and as you can see over the past few years, it's evolved to each one of them adding in SaaS, adding in AI, adding in UCaaS, CCaaS, things like that. And suddenly your purview as a FinOps administrator in your organization just kept growing and growing. Unfortunately, each one of them in and of itself, it's a major item. It requires deep knowledge, company sprawl, individual governance, right? The topic of SaaS, we've noticed, is an entire different group in an organization than the topic of infrastructure. Right, we're talking to different leadership and then a FinOps team trying to kind of pull them all together. And Tangoe typically is trying to help you pull them all together. AI cost management now has become the new dominant priority. 98% of organizations manage AI spend. It's up rapidly from 2024. It's one of the fastest growing areas in FinOps right now, but it's kind of touching all of these areas. It touches SaaS, it touches infrastructure. It's becoming a bit more strategic and executive aligned. So luckily, over the past few years, the idea of FinOps has gone from a small team to companies embracing it and then a culture-wide embrace in organizations. And the more and more we see customers do that from our end, the better and more success we see in their day-to-day management and year-to-year management of cloud, specifically cloud costs. But that executive alignment with CIOs and CTOs within organizations, they have major influence both in the technology that's being used and the investment decisions of where it's being used. So being able to strategically show exactly what the spend is, the unit economics, the cost to value ratio is big. So ultimately what we want to see is more and more adoption, even though right now I would say the maturity is uneven. And I say that within the organizations who've really embraced FinOps, who hasn't yet, who consider themselves strong at it, advanced, just starting out, the whole crawl, walk, run scenario. But it's certainly an area that keeps evolving day to day in its practice, but also evolving in what we see being added to it as a discipline or a domain that has to be managed.
Thanks, Paulo. We always like to go back to the FinOps Foundation surveys of membership. And for a good number of years, workload optimization and actual waste reduction has been a top or leading priority And it's where we're going to focus the rest of this conversation, really, because although it's a top priority, it's where many, many organizations tend to struggle. I think the good news is that the more comfortable people come with more automated infrastructure management, the more success potential comes into this. But the interesting thing is, and we're not fixating in this talk about AI, because I mean, if you're anywhere in or related to IT, it is everywhere. Not surprising that it's jumped to the top of these focus areas for people in FinOps, but it only just pushes the workload optimization and waste reduction item down a little bit, which, we would say, okay, well, AI is going to trump everything. It's a big part of it, but it all starts to come into the same kind of basket as general infrastructure optimization. It's just another one of the complexities, and we'll talk more about that. So those statistics are always interesting. From a scope of functionality point of view, just to keep it simple, we're two vendors here talking about our capabilities. You can think of Tangoe very much focused on the FinOps visibility, governance, and insight into what's happening at scale with your spend. And then Kubex focuses very much on everything related to the infrastructure and the resource requirements for the infrastructure. If you do these things well, you optimize cloud and Kubernetes and AI, it all runs better, but it also potentially is much cheaper. And that's the role within an overall FinOps lens. So that's how the two solutions relate. As we present them and demo them, you'll see very distinct leaning toward dollars and understanding what's happening from a dollar perspective and controlling that. From Tangoe and from Kubex, you'll see very workload oriented, much more infrastructure oriented focus. Paulo, do you want to take a moment and just talk about that world, that dollar world?
Absolutely. Tangoe started a lot originally its cloud journey around visibility, right? Specifically that word. I felt like we almost overused it in the start of this journey, but it became that way because we highly focused on data here. We're really good at collecting data, cleansing data, organizing it, and ultimately presentment of that data to provide what we thought of as true visibility, true cost of ownership is what we're trying to get to. So for us, when we think about what FinOps is looking for, a lot of the domain principles are around the first two that you see there: cost transparency and cross-team accountability. Cost transparency is easy. Visualize costs, show where they go. But we tried to take it a step further in the sense of that having real-time visibility that's tied to your organization, your allocation, your different business units, chargeback based on usage, having it aligned to your financial needs is important. But ultimately, it's the only way we're able to get to cross-team accountability. And until you can kind of crack that nut over at that organization, right, get that actual cross-team accountability, FinOps allowed us to have that conversation. It had defined principles to say, this is how you get there. This is why it's proven to be successful. Tens of thousands of organizations are using it successfully. AWS, Azure, GCP, and other vendors are bought in. Now we're able to get that accountability. And with that accountability, you start getting more decision-making, right? You start getting to the crux of the problem Chuck and I are talking about here, which is, getting to opportunity identification, seeing that optimization opportunity and making sure you don't get stuck in being able to actually make it happen, right? You start to be able to now put together governance and compliance rules. By having multiple teams now have ownership, governance and compliance is immediately realized it's not just an IT function, it's not just the FinOps team's function, it's not just whoever stands up the AWS server or changes a different storage mechanism inside their EC2. It is now the ability to lead towards smart decision-making and maturity because everyone's involved, everyone's adopting into the principles, everyone's got accountability into their individualized costs to their projects, and ultimately that leads to a much greater level of success. But to the next slide, we still have this one particular problem, which is the execution gap, right? Something that Tangoe and Kubex kind of coming together and discussing. This is an area where we can visualize. We can ultimately show even optimization opportunities, but how do we get them to actually execute? A lot of FinOps implementations fail at this execution area. And it's not because there's not enough people there who are knowledgeable in their segment or know what they have to do. It's usually these areas are there because there's not protections in place of who made the decision, that accountability isn't set in stone. There's a lot of workflows and processes that tend to slow down these decision-making moments But really what we try to do is FinOps tends to stay more centralized, right? They want to get that accountability over to the engineers who actually drive that spend. They are trying to eliminate this disconnect between ownership and outcomes. So when your incentives are misaligned, right, your protections of, well, I had to do this project because we had to build this and get it to market. Well, now our cost ballooned. Well, nobody analyzed it. You start to realize from executive leadership down to product, down to engineering, down to sales, everything has to now suddenly align how you're using these cloud generated tools. And FinOps brings in the right components. But as soon as the topic of we want to reduce costs, our costs have gone up, now we want to reduce costs. We've been reducing costs, but now we want to right size and keep it that way. Well, that last mile where the execution is breaking, it's data quality that you have to maintain. It's your allocations of accountability for costs have to be persisted. And this is where Tango's really coming in to help to maintain that level of accountability day to day, fully automated, seeing it in your reporting, so that as the complexity continues to kind of outpace capability, multi-cloud, SaaS fraud, AI workloads being added, when your governance is in place, your visibility is in place. We just had a customer reach out to us and say, hey, we have a new thing coming. You guys are doing a great job showing us all of our different distributions, allocations, and cost miles over the last couple of years. Can we talk about this vendor? Can we talk about this new type of costs? I'm going to bring in another team. It is exactly the conversation that makes things work. And Chuck, you just mentioned you're going to get into it a little bit further when you demo how Kubex takes that optimization piece to automate components of it. So the right sizing is happening. So the execution is now also automated in and of itself. So as these decisions come in, you're just kind of like pulling and tugging on levers a little bit and really trying to get yourself, your Kubernetes constantly being automated, your trust in the engine that you're using, and that solution has the right guardrails and the right reports that you know the right things are happening and you're really confident with the results.
Let's jump and have a look at that visibility side of things.
So I'm going to try to keep this tight because we want to get through a lot of information. I narrowed down some specific dashboards I wanted to show, but this visibility, when we talk about that terminology, we talk about allocation, chargeback, we think about a lot of things that customers come to us, which is around, I want to see weighted distribution of my cost allocations. I have reserved instance and savings plans, and I want to see that allocated out towards usage. Those are simple phrases, difficult to execute, but the report ultimately seems simple. But it's the mechanism behind the scene, that logic that Tango really has embraced to ultimately allow our customers to come in and say, what's my overall view? What's my overall cost? What are my different categories of where my service categories normalized to FinOps? So we work with version 1.2, the latest FinOps normalized data schema for infrastructure. What's my different cost by cost centers? We've sat with customers and said, what's your cost center structure? What's your HR structure? Who owns what areas? What visibility is allowed? And then what are all your multi-vendors, right? And this allows us to show customers very specifically, this is where everything is. This is where the costs are coming in month to month, day by day. And behind the scenes, all of these individualized charges or maybe uplift rules that you've given us, sometimes it's tax rules, different profit sharing, or companies sometimes try to become a profit center themselves and they charge back within their organization. So we raise the cost. These are all different ways of us taking these at the most granular level. Like I said, Tango likes to work with the data and give customers a complete FinOps utility. Our dashboards component allows customers to drill in from anywhere. We can also customize and build these dashboards on the fly and then say, I want to see just AWS, show me everything. I want to see that particular area, this particular cost center. You see everything's changing here. And once I do that, maybe I want to put an alert. So now we've built in an area for our customers to say, as you start to understand what you want to manage, who you want to ultimately be notified when, for what changes, what team members, what's going on. We've noticed customers have said, now that I've got everything right size, so when Chuck and their team have given us what they needed, can I now make it available to say, just alert me when the problem happens? I can see these reports every day. They can be scheduled to me, but now can I move on? Can you just tell me when a specific variance by percentage or amount has changed? And that's where those anomaly detections that customers come to us about kind of get automated and put in place. From a usage allocation standpoint, this is an area that's maybe a bit more boring, but from the financial teams, you think about the accountability and bringing multiple teams together. The finance teams really come to us and say, I have to give executive leadership together with my IT leadership, what's going on where. what environments, what cost centers allocated appropriately by usage. Can you show me specifically by my different business units where these costs go? What are my top areas of allocation for my sub accounts? And then ultimately across my different cost centers, tags, I've labeled these projects, these environments, these people. What are the individual taxes, uplifts, and whatnot? So this is a quick way for us to show specifically to customers as they come to us how they want to view data, how they want to materialize that to have those accountability discussions internally for FinOps and see different variance growth over the years, over the months actually is where we want to showcase that. Now, the last things I'll show here, and we can tie things like budget and forecasting, but I really want to talk about some of the administrative side, which is under data management. These dashboards are great. Everything's drillable. I can right click at any point in time and look at hundreds of different FinOps controlled values of service category or subtypes in here. But how does that happen? We allow customers to load in their invoice. So we do penny to penny matching, reconciliation, penny to penny cost distribution and allocation. We allow them to load in their own metadata. Here are my own projects tied to my own tags, tied to my own sub accounts internally, globally, across my organization. This is data we will feed and combine together with the FinOps model. These are my business allocation rules. Can I build in as many custom rules against that data of how I want that chargeback and showback to appear? These are areas in the organization that companies that are highly engaged with Tango, which is a high measurement of success with us, we get to implement all these things. We get to sit in analytics designer and build out all of those dashboards for them on the fly and ultimately allow them to view specifically how they want everything to work and change and help them succeed in FinOps.
The depth and configurability in what Paula showed is incredibly important, as well as accuracy, because as we found, when you're showing back to an organization or individuals or departments or divisions, if it's not accurate, it's really difficult. So that accurate view is incredibly important.
Trust is easy to gain, but quickly lost, right?
Yeah.
And then harder to get back. Absolutely.
Yeah. So if we transition to the notion of, okay, I have a lay of the land, what's involved in actually impacting those large buckets of spend? And where we fit is helping organizations get through what creates a lot of the gap that Paula talked about. There is, in almost every case, at some point at a larger enterprise, an execution gap that can be quite systemic, that actually optimizing the infrastructure that's driving those bills, it often requires a lot of participation in and approvals and tracking and assessing of risk by people that aren't necessarily measured on efficiency. The prime directive of any application owner generally is to make sure that the stuff runs well, and is always available. And that's really the way it should be. But that creates a lot of cautious checks and balances that have for many, many years in IT been a source of, you can't debate it. It's important. Change control, change windows, these sorts of things. So there is this understanding that you have to be able to deal with the fact that people aren't accustomed to thinking about optimizing infrastructure. And you got to change the way or the level of confidence people have as they go and accept or allow change. Secondarily, things like Kubernetes and next generation infrastructure make this notion of ticket-based and manual intervention by humans as they become aware of an issue and are asked to go and do something. It's really difficult if you're dealing beyond a server or a VM down into individual processes or containers now, or containerized workloads, because they're constantly changing, they're very dynamic, and you just can't deal with it on a manual basis. It's just not possible. It's not feasible. So how do you deal with that? And then the third point is, and this is, we believe, a coming wave, that the nature of AI and inference-based workloads, forget training and models and the like, the nature of workloads as we become more and more agentic and we drive more and more inference workload onto things like Kubernetes, this level of utilization and variability is going to drive the next wave of cost concern. It's inevitable. You cannot have the amount of uptake without, at some point, a supply chain perspective that it's got to be corrected, it's got to be optimized. So we see that as a coming wave. Kubernetes and dealing with that from a complexity perspective is actually a great training ground for what will eventually ride on it with respect to AI and consumption of things like GPU. So, what does the problem look like when you have this notion of human controlled infrastructure and no automation? You tend to get environments that look like this. And Dave will demo some of this, where the actual required by specification amount of resource, let's say at the CPU level, is vastly different than the actual true need of the environment. So the blue line is the actual utilization. The orange line is what's provisioned from a resources requested perspective. And then the gray line is the amount of node infrastructure that gets provisioned in order to meet those requirements. And these gaps are where the opportunity lies. It is the gap that's built in by humans being cautious. And if it's only ever specified by a developer and then never returned to look at or to optimize it, you end up with this huge amount of slack inside organizations that is really ripe for improvement. So what does Kubex do? We watch over the very, very detailed behavior of every element of the infrastructure. We apply ML. We understand the usage patterns, the replication patterns in the cases of things that are scaling up and down. We allow you to define policy that says how you want to treat certain classes of applications or infrastructure. Market facing crown jewels versus perhaps something that's running overnight and people aren't waiting for. All of that specification. The combination of all these things allows the engine to, in a very deterministic way, tell you exactly what should be done from an individual container perspective, right down to how those are placed onto nodes or GPUs or the underlying infrastructure. It passes through a highly controllable automation controller that can include human in the loop or full autonomous action. The end game is optimized resource. So if you have a very rigorous approach that derives very precise recommendations and factors in policy and all of the sensitivities and white space that needs to maybe be built in, and then you generate very precise actions, what you find is that engineers start to trust and allow the controller, because it's got all of these checks and balances, to apply the change and improve the state of the infrastructure. And what that looks like in practice is the correction of what is provisioned on a container basis starts to converge on the true requirements, which then allows the nodes to come down in a logical, stepwise fashion. And it's when you do that that you reduce the cost. And Dave's going to show you some of this live.
Thanks very much, Chuck. What we'll do now is we'll walk through a quick demo of the product, the user interface. What we'll do is show you some of the concepts that Chuck talked about in the presentation, how we go through those in an actual real-world environment. What you're looking at now is the primary landing screen for Kubex, and what you can see is some summary information about your environment. You can see here that we support multiple clusters, so you have insights into your entire Kubernetes environment, and you'll also notice that we have two prominent charts here that Chuck showed. These are charts that show you your resource utilization in a few different ways. First of all, you'll notice that we have two different charts. We have CPU and we have memory. And these are the two most prominent resources that you're going to need to manage for compute resources. And there's three dimensions that we're showing here. So just a review, the blue line represents what your actual workload utilization is. So this is what your applications are using from a resource perspective. The next line is the orange one. This shows what our requests are. So what is the guaranteed capacity that we're allocating for these workloads to run in? And in most cases, you're going to want this yellow line to be above your actual utilization. So this is a fairly normal view of what a typical customer environment would look like. And then we have at the top here, this is your actual allocatable capacity. So what your actual node capacity is from your cloud service provider. this is actually what you are paying for. So you want to make sure that as much as possible, you're reducing the gaps between these lines. You're always going to want a little bit of a buffer between these, but the gaps between your utilization and the amount of guaranteed capacity you're setting aside, and then the gap between that and what your actual total paid node capacity is, you want to make sure that those are reduced as much as possible. Any significant gaps represent waste. And in fact, you can see in this environment, there are fairly large gaps between these different resources. And you can also see that for memory in particular, we have a huge amount of capacity in our nodes for memory, but what we're utilizing is a tiny fraction of that. So you really want to optimize this as much as possible by reducing the gaps between these lines. In addition, these two charts represent waste and slack, as Chuck was talking about in the presentation. And that's caused by workloads where you're allocating too many resources. But you can also have workloads where you're not quite allocating enough. What that can do is introduce risk into your environment. So what we have here is a pane that shows us what the risks are within our environment. Again, I don't want to get too technical, so I'm not going to deep dive into what all of these numbers mean, but just keep in mind that when you don't allocate sufficient resources for one of your applications, it can result in things like the application being killed, or even things like CPU being throttled. And then what that's going to do is it's going to impact the performance of your application. So we want to make sure we look at this equation from both sides. How do we reduce waste, reduce slack, but also reduce risk within the environment? Now, what our product does is it, again, as Chuck mentioned, it collects detailed information on how your workloads are running, the resources they're using, and generates actionable recommendations on how you can fully optimize these. And a lot of that is shown in this pane here, where we actually see a breakdown of the clusters within our environment. We'll actually expand this just so you can see that it has a breakdown of the potential opportunity within all of our clusters, shows what the amount of waste is, what we're currently spending, and how much of that can be reduced through optimization. Now, if at any point we wanted to see individual recommendations, we could click through here, and this would take us to a line-by-line list of the applications we're running within our cluster and what the recommendation is to fully optimize that application and that workload. Now, for the sake of time, we're not going to click through that, but keep in mind, we have a tremendous amount of detail that we can surface here within the product. One of the great benefits is while we're generating these application by application recommendations, we have the ability to automate the remediation of those issues. And it's very flexible. You have complete control over what you automate and what you don't. So for example, you might decide that you have an absolute mission critical application. You may not feel comfortable doing automation and right-sizing that in real time. So you have the capability of saying we don't want to automate certain portions of our environment, whether that be individual namespaces, individual applications. You have complete control over that. The good news is that automation allows you to realize value very quickly. And what does that look like? We've got a portion of our environment. So what you're looking at is a fairly normal unoptimized environment. That's what we're looking at right now. But we've actually enabled automation on one cluster. So we're going to zero in on one particular cluster where we're actually implementing these recommendations, and we can see the benefits that accrue. Again, what we've done here is we've just zoomed in on one particular Kubernetes cluster. And again, we've got our resource utilization here over time. And what you can see is going back to around May 29th, we had something unoptimized and fairly typical here, where there's large gaps between your total resources you're paying for, the amount of capacity you are guaranteeing, and what your actual utilization is. However, right around May 30th, we implement automation. And this starts to automatically right-size our resources, and you see that our requests begin to go down. And right around that same time, as requests are going down, you see the amount of node capacity you're paying for also reduces. That happens because we have node scale downs, we have more efficient bin packing. So we're able to fit those workloads onto a smaller compute footprint while still having the same performance. So our utilization is unchanged, we just don't have as much waste in the environment. The other thing you'll notice as well, here we're able to significantly reduce these gaps, but in addition, not only have we reduced waste, but these node risks and container risks that existed have now disappeared. So what the product does and what automation allows you to do is, I often say it allows you to have your cake and eat it too. You're able to both save, reduce waste within your environment, but at the same time, you're also able to eliminate risk within the environment, making sure you don't have undersized containers that are starved for resources. So really what this allows you to do is approach this equation from both sides.
That's, just to add to that, a great way to get technical staff and app owners on side with accepting optimizations is that you can do things like get rid of memory related kills and infrastructure that's not running the way anyone thinks it is. It's the same problem when humans guess what the requirements are and then they set the stuff and leave it. Most environments we see have excess capacity, significant excess capacity, but also have stuff that's sort of hidden away and not running well. And so by doing this, you're exposing both sides. Thanks very much for the demo, Dave. We wanted to share, and Paulo touched a little bit on this as we wrap up. You know, if you're talking to your organization on some of these themes, you observe this gap. What are the things that can help get to success? In our experience, and Paulo mentioned this, senior level commitment to executing an optimization and dealing with that inevitable resistance is super important. If you don't have organizational drive to get to the change that allows people to see the lights are still on, stuff might be actually running better, and the bills are coming down, you never get that reinforcement loop that says, okay, we can do this and it's safe and it's measured and it's okay to right size infrastructure. You need that top level push. Without it, it's very difficult to succeed. It doesn't have to be all or nothing from an automation perspective. I would say it is the great enabler with respect to actually being able to succeed because you don't rely on manual intervention, but it doesn't have to be all or nothing. But it might release you from perhaps an old school way of, let's say, ticketing and approving change to something that's more rapid, but still has human in the loop. There are some actually quite innovative methods of integrating with DevOps processes and procedures and intercepting and correcting when things are deployed. Some of our more advanced customers do that kind of thing where they acquire the optimal recommendation through APIs and correct it through the deployment of, let's say, a new release, that kind of thing. Building in time and attention to getting engineering staff and application owners confident in the methods and the rigor that we're talking about. Trials in dev test environments, very successful. So you put this stuff up, you see the data, you see the recommendations, you action some of them, you turn on automation, you watch the lines converge, you see things run better. That's a great help in making progress and closing the loop on automated change in a trial. Another thing that we see is that, especially in a larger organization, depending on where the pressure is from a perception of cost or where the greatest budget pressures are, there are usually organizations that'll say, we'll go first. We will volunteer to participate and maybe be the example of what good looks like. So always look for those opportunities to have a particularly interested part of the business get engaged and tackle some of this stuff. So those are just some thoughts on how to move forward with some of these concepts that we've talked about. Paulo, I'll pass to you to summarize the two sides of the equation here.
Absolutely. Thank you, Chuck. And to continue bringing this home, you've heard from both sides. This partnership between us saw these two elements that both of us were individualized experts in, but ultimately from the FinOps story, especially the gap in FinOps, you require both to be working at its best to really be successful. So from the Tango side, the biggest takeaways here are this multi-cloud visibility and cost control. This is where we try to shine single pane of glass scenario, but it's not just the top 4 CSPs, but also in a SaaS model and UCaaS model, we do that as well, taking that granular cost allocation and ultimately allowing you to not just visualize it, but even being able to process and pay invoices. We can generate GL files or AP files specific to those finance rules already allocated with the proper showback. Governance and policy enforcement. This is areas we can help by giving you that visibility, but also budget tracking from your team, your organization's full budget, any policy restrictions or enforcement that's required, whether enforcing something is tagged or properly controlled. We can manage and showcase that visibility, and those audit trails allow for the accountability to happen. Actionable insights for FinOps. A lot of times the variance components, the notification alerts, every single day that the new data, the new cure files come into us from these CSPs, every single notification, you can build as many as you want on the fly, just get triggered. So at any time, you can have this immediate insight that something has spiked on the 1st, 2nd, 15th day of the month, more than you expected, fully aligned to any of your KPIs, over budget, under budget, whatever, in any direction. It allows you to start making those strategic business decisions. Maybe that project that was just launched or a deployment that just went, something was wrong. And lastly, that chargeback and showback enablement. Department by department, business unit accountability, working with your specific tagging needs and fixing data. Even if you physically can't fix it on AWS, we'll fix it in post, let's say, right? We'll fix it on what visualizes on our application. Aligning with Kubex now, you heard Chuck and saw the great demo by David really talk about how your Kubernetes and GPU resource optimization is kind of put on rails, automated as best as it can. What's not automated is visualized. Most importantly, the decisions that you're able to make with what they're showing you, what they're able to look at your infrastructure specifically in its day-to-day use becomes pivotal. Having that optimization built with proper guardrails, especially on the optimization side, Chuck, I know even from my side, I would always hear customers say, well, hang on, how do I know what you're doing is accurate? What if I want to make sure this is hesitancy, right? What's changing my environment without my control? The guardrails become important, right? As you stated here, no tickets, no manual tuning cycles, no drift. They become really critical in the success and most importantly in the trust level that we talked about earlier. Recommendation to real outcomes. Working together with Kubex, our customers have seen true savings, true real outcomes. They've helped us close the gap for them and also saying, hey, you're seeing all this, you want to right size it, you want to know how, you want additional data specifically on what you can right size where, and then you want to see the costs come down. This is an area that I can't stress the whole real outcomes enough, probably as the biggest takeaway from this webinar. Everything else I talk about leads you there, and everything Chuck and David talk about actually finally push you over the line to have that complete picture. And workload level attribution that feeds chargeback. This is an area that, think about GPU utilization broken down by workload and team. I'm getting that more and more. Chuck has told us a lot about their expansion into the GPU workloads and the asks from their customers, ultimately driving into the AI space. It's something both of us are going to be really working together in both of our respective areas to deliver our customers, not just what they're looking for in visibility, but ultimately what they're looking for in being able to action and then actually actioning them. So thank you.
Thanks, Paulo. While we pause, QR code here if you would like to speak with us a little further about anything you saw here today. It is a unified request. You don't have to know whether you should be talking to Tangoe or to Kubex, depending on your interests. We will stream you to the appropriate discussion through that follow-up link. Please do take advantage. With respect to questions, someone asked, Paulo, where do customers get the most or the best value in instituting cross-charging?
Good question. So teams that are highly engaged that come to us from multiple levels, specifically from the finance team, if they have a FinOps team, but their executive leadership is in charge or at least empowering that discussion, we notice that when they share with us their specific finance rules, it allows us to not just show what costs are coming in where, we will go down to the absolute micro level of granularity. And that chargeback allows them to say, great, in our organization, this isn't just our 1.3 million a year AWS invoice bill or our marketplace charges or our monthly 20K Azure bill. This is specifically where each of those costs went, tied to teams, tied to cost centers, tied to different business locations, or down to actual projects because they're tagged appropriately. Those teams succeed very well because the conversations in organizations aren't what are we paying in AWS, it's why and where are we paying this in AWS. So those companies succeed really well because the conversation is so easy. Our dashboards and reporting, and we can automate to them, visualize the actual thumb on the pulse kind of a thing of what's going on to areas that everyone understands. You don't have to be a cloud infrastructure expert to understand this data. You understand project A under this cost center to this location under this team, we're spending XYZ. This is your budget. I can now charge that back to you. So now there's easy show back, easy accountability, and those customers succeed because then everybody gets bought in and everybody's like marching to the same beat of the drum that ultimately, Chuck, leads to actionable. We want to reduce costs. I want to action it. Yes, everybody's bought in. We need to reduce my personal costs because it's my project and the CEO is looking at me, not the IT team. So those teams tend to really succeed when they're highly engaged.
Thanks for that, David. More of a workload level question. How long do you have to watch a workload before you can optimize it? I guess the question is how much time required.
When you think about granting or taking resources away from a workload, if you see that a workload doesn't have enough resources, you're not giving it the CPU or the memory that it requires, you can start making those changes very, very quickly. So we start making recommendations to remediate risk where you need to upsize a workload. We start making those recommendations after an hour of collecting data. Where you're taking resources away, you want to tread a lot more carefully because you never want to trade savings for risk. So what we typically do is, this is configurable, but we usually wait about 1 week before we start downsizing resources, because you want to make sure that you're not taking away resources that are actually needed by that workload. You want to have at least a week worth of history before you start downsizing things.
Thanks, Dave. I appreciate everyone's time. Thank you, Paulo, for your great content. Thank you, Dave, for your demo prowess. And again, welcome anyone to follow up with us if they'd like a deeper dive and further discussion on any of the topics today. Thank you all and have a great day.
Take care. Thank you.